I am absolutely delighted today about the presentation. Peter and I have been working and doing this for a couple of years now, and sometimes life gets in the way, and life got in our way many times. So we are so delighted that he is here today, and he is going to do his wonderful presentation. And I just want to tell you a little bit about it, okay, about Peter actually. So Peter is Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project, with which he has been affiliated for 13 years. He is the current Vice President of the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, serves as a trustee of the Dutchess County Historical Society, and through Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project, he is also affiliated with Celebrating the African Spirit, known as CAS, in Poughkeepsie, and serves on the steering committee of the Northern Slavery Collective. Before his retirement in 2018, Mr. Bunten was the education manager for historic Hudson Valley. He has a master's degree in historical studies with an emphasis on public history from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is a native of Poughkeepsie, lived here, attended schools here, and his house is just down the road, as he said. So please give a big round of applause for Peter Bunten.
Thank you, Shirley. Can everybody hear okay? Thank you for that great introduction. It is really a pleasure to be here. Shirley's right. Just a few houses up there, 46 Parker Avenue is where I grew up, and I'm honored to have my oldest sister Mabel here today. So thank you, Mabel. It's great. I do want to recognize as well, Shirley mentioned the Celebrating the African Spirit, and the head of that organization, Carmen McGill, is here. Wave your hand, Carmen.
And Katie, hi.
Where Katie's here? Yes, somewhere. Where are you, Katie? Oh, there's Katie. That's great. It's great. I'm sorry for all of these long names. It would be great to be part of an organization that was called like clans. But unfortunately, I'm part of all of these long named organizations. So, the first enslaved people were brought to the Hudson Valley almost 400 years ago. Within a century, the Hudson Valley became the center of enslavement in New York, and New York in turn held the largest number of enslaved people across the northern colonies. Dutchess County, along with the land on both sides of the river, stretching from Westchester all the way up to Albany, became the driving force behind the predominantly agricultural economy of New York for over a century. Essential to the success of that economy was black enslavement. Right here in Poughkeepsie, at one time, 20 to 25% of white households owned at least one enslaved person. Our valley was a dangerous place for black people, both enslaved and free. Strict and oppressive codes hemmed in their movement and behavior. At the same time, our region was a byway for freedom seekers, a better description than runaway slaves. The river below us, as well as its banks and inland areas, were major routes for enslaved men and women seeking freedom from bondage. There were so many freedom seekers up and down, it was as if they were the river themselves. So today we're going to examine some of these dangerous conditions, the resistance of the enslaved population, and the routes to escape along the Hudson River. These are stories of pain, sorrow, lost potential of a people hemmed in on all sides, living within spaces of danger. but these are also stories of bravery, heroism, the will to live as free people. To understand the painful history of black enslavement in America, we need to quickly look at its origins. From about 1500 to the mid-1800s, more than 12.5 million men and women were taken from Africa and moved across the Atlantic. The greatest number went to Brazil, a substantial number to the West Indies, and about 400,000 were brought to North America, the Gulf Coast, the southern colonies, and some to the northern colonies. Those 400,000, beginning in 1619 at Jamestown, would eventually grow to 4 million enslaved people at the start of the Civil War. The Middle Passage was the name given to the dangerous voyage from Africa, taking up to 3 months to cross the Atlantic with Africans stacked below. These voyages resulted in the deaths of close to 2 million people. Those who died were thrown overboard. Some people rebelled and fought their captors or jumped overboard to certain death rather than be enslaved. This violent resettlement of Africans, who were now facing a terrifying present and unknown future, was a diaspora of unprecedented magnitude. When and where could they hope to find a new home, a safe place? The Middle Passage turned the whole of the Atlantic region into one giant space of danger. And it wasn't just European ships involved in the slave trade. Roughly 3/4 of those Africans brought to our colonial settlement came on ships originating from our own colonies: Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island. Merchants, landowners, and often even small farmers and business owners embraced the slave system, creating ready markets for both new African arrivals and those earlier arrivals who were being traded across the colonies. How could this be? I'm sure some of you are asking. I never knew that there was slavery in the North. Slavery in Poughkeepsie? And you would be right in thinking that, because I'll bet most of you, were never taught about it in school. We learned that slavery was a southern phenomenon related to cotton and sugar and rice and tobacco, products that didn't grow here. But all of the original British colonies in the North instituted some form of black enslavement. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York was the leading one. The practice began here in 1627, a mere 8 years after Jamestown, and it continued for another 200 years until 1827, when New York State finally ended chattel slavery, almost, which we'll see later. This is the area we're talking about, the Hudson Valley, stretching from Albany down to Westchester, and then across the river, Orange, Sullivan, etc. Originally, these were Dutch lands held by the New Netherland Company. From its birth in 1683 as a county until 1713, the population of Dutchess was so low that it actually was part of Ulster County for administrative purposes. But as the 18th century progressed, population began to grow, and so a census taken in 1737, there were now 3,100 people, white people, along with 262 enslaved people, representing about 8% of the total. 518 family names were recorded, and the growth here reflected similar gains in other counties in the Hudson Valley. The largest number of families here settled along Rhinebeck, Fishkill, and Poughkeepsie. So we're looking at population growth for both white settlers and enslaved black people along a fairly narrow strip abutting the Hudson River. Many enslaved people on both sides were working to build this new society and economy. Under Dutch rule until 1664, when England took over, the conception of slavery was not as fixed as it was later to become. This was partly because the Dutch were focused on profits from trade, not on creating settlements. As such, about 2/3 of the enslaved people in New Amsterdam and New Netherlands were actually owned by the Dutch West Indies Company, not by individual people. But with the British, it transformed immediately. They were making huge profits from the international slave trade, but they were also focused on the creation of permanent colonial settlements. We probably all remember this from our high school books and college books. The British colonies needed labor to support their colonization efforts, and there were not enough European colonists willing to do that. It was very tough to attract European farmers across the ocean. So enslaved Africans filled the bill. And to manage the growing number of enslaved people, the British soon instituted a series of slave codes to strictly circumscribe the lives of the enslaved and to suppress and punish any hint of rebellion. The imposition of these slave codes tells us how important enslaved labor was becoming to New York's economy and social system. New York, under British rule, saw a full-scale entrenchment of black slavery. The restrictive legislation sought to control the lives of the enslaved, but these same restrictions had powerful implications for the free black people living here as well. As one example, the southern British colonies enacted a measure that punished any person for harboring a, quote, runaway slave. They would charge 20 pounds of tobacco, a very stiff penalty. The penalty was much worse for the offending runaway if he or she was caught and then repeated the offense. They would be branded with the letter R in the cheek. Notices to this effect were ordered to be posted on official buildings and other public spaces to ensure that everyone was aware of the problem. This action was taken in Virginia in the year 1642, barely 2 decades after the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in 1619. Similar policies began to be developed in other southern colonies. New York's restrictive provisions began in 1681, and then 1683, and then again in 1702. These various so-called slave codes were institutionalized under a set of restrictions in 1712. And these came hard on the heels of a slave uprising in New York City where 9 white people were killed. 23 enslaved Africans were executed in retaliation, some burned alive. Now, this act for preventing, suppressing, and punishing the conspiracy and insurrection of Negroes and other slaves in 1712 included provisions inhibiting all black people, not just the enslaved people. In other words, let me just give one example. The law prohibited groups larger than 3 African Americans. It didn't matter whether it was 1 enslaved person and 2 free blacks, or 2 or 1 or all 3. White people didn't necessarily know who was an enslaved person and food was free. For passing in neighborhoods or on trips, enslaved Africans needed to carry a pass, a notice from their owner that they were headed from here to there, etc. They could not carry a cane, could not carry or own a gun. If they assaulted a white person, they were liable to be killed. The restriction affected blacks, free blacks as well, as I said. Two more examples from the 1712 Code. It required that owners wishing to free their slaves had to pay a 200-pound manumission fee. And they had to pay each person they freed a yearly stipend of 20 pounds, supposedly to prevent the free person from falling into poverty, thereby becoming a cost to the town. You can imagine the cooling effect this would have on any slaveholder wishing to free his or her slave. So these various slave codes and restrictions essentially inhibited black people from living their lives outside the confines of their enslavement or of their own domestic space. As historian Andrea Mosterman and others have written, this had the effect of, quote, turning the area's public spaces into white spaces. So what did enslaved people do, and why were they so valuable? Great sources of information to answer these questions come from diaries, record books, notices of slave sales, runaway slave advertisements. So we'll take a look at a few of these aspects. Because of its arable soil and location near to New York City markets and Hudson River ports, farming was one of the largest occupations of white settlers and enslaved people in our area. Everything from growing wheat, oats, hemp, flax, vegetables, and eventually fruit orchards were common in the Hudson Valley during this period of the 18th century. Farming also implied the need for buildings and services to support the industry. Some of this work you might still be able to see around the county, where there are still scores of stone walls and stone fences that were constructed, many of them likely by enslaved people. Enslaved people filled labor shortages not only in semi-skilled jobs, but also in jobs that were highly skilled. For example, in milling, it might take up to 8 years for someone to learn to become a master miller. Likewise for blacksmithing. A boat pilot required knowledge of engineering, the ability to read maps. Oh, I better talk closer. How about that? Okay. Writing and arithmetic fluency for bills of lading, etc. Slavers were known to traffic in Africans who were skilled in a variety of trades. So, for example, the slaver might put out a request for a carpenter or blacksmith and then purchase such a person from a slave catcher in Africa for transport to America, or at one of the slave markets in New York City, and for a time there was a smaller slave market up in Albany. Enslaved people also had to adapt to changing skill requirements. While grain production was the mainstay of the Mid-Hudson economy during the 1700s, farmers increasingly diversified their production. So all in all, enslaved people were regularly engaged in skilled work. The skills which either they began enslavement with or they learned as they performed a wide variety of tasks over here in America. The variety of domestic work generally fell to women and girls. Spinning wool, sewing, cooking, tending smaller vegetable plots, childcare, and a myriad other tasks of keeping the owner's house and family functioning. This all fell to them. On smaller farms, women might also be found taking care of the cows, chickens, other livestock. This division of labor tended to keep women closer to owners, where a house might provide some degree of comfort, but this proximity also put them at greater risk for sexual exploitation. Children would be expected to carry on in their parents' footsteps. Some men were employed in domestic service. The chefs, who might work on wealthy plantations, a few of which we have here in Dutchess County, they were also in charge of preparing food for the wealthy owners and their guests, and coachmen, and drivers, all the livery staff tended to be men. You've been hearing me use the term enslaved people, or enslaved men and women, more so than slave, when describing those people in forced servitude. This is purposeful, and it is meant to help us focus on the personhood, the humanity of the people we're talking about. People who were enslaved had individual lives, families, religions, cultures, despite their forced, racialized servitude. In other words, a person's condition of life did not define his or her identity and humanity. Enslaved people had agency, even while being enslaved. Despite the often horrible conditions, they tried, often successfully, to have a family and close relationships, live spiritual lives, and create a variety of cultural legacies. While enslavement certainly circumscribed their actions, many enslaved people also found ways to resist their condition. And one of the most powerful examples of this agency was expressed in the large number of people who ran away from their slave masters. Some of the major sources we have for understanding the extent of this rebellion are the so-called runaway slave ads that were published in local newspapers, including the earliest version of today's Poughkeepsie Journal. And those ads tell us that enslaved people were running away from at least the very early 1700s, and if we had newspapers back in the late 1600s, I'm sure there would be notices for runaway slaves again. So it was the action of people running away that led to a movement to help them escape. Long before the period that we commonly understand as the age of the Underground Railroad, which is basically starting from 1830 or so. Enslaved people were running away. Many notices were posted on public buildings and local newspapers, both north and south, notifying citizens and readers to be on the lookout for so-called runaways. And the notices also warned everyone not to aid the freedom seekers in their escape, under threat of fine or some other penalty. Running away was the ultimate form of resistance, and very costly to the owner. It meant that a freedom seeker's labor was lost for some period, or perhaps forever. Without that labor, the owner might need to purchase another slave or pay a reward or bounty for the return of their, quote, human property. These ads were posted by owners, and they provide a wealth of information. Basically, to state it another way, enslaved people were emancipating themselves. I don't know if you have some thoughts or feelings, or you read something about the Underground Railroad in Dutchess County and was my house. The enslaved people were emancipating themselves. important for us to remember this when we begin to explore the history of the Underground Railroad. Moving away from their known environment, their familiar, relatively safe space was always dangerous. If caught, they could be severely punished. In several instances, freedom seekers were caught, but then tried to escape again. In Defiance, the second edition, edited by Susan Stesson-Cohn and Ashley Herbert-Diogini, who hail from our own backyard just across the river. This is an indispensable source for learning about the enslaved men, women, and sometimes children who lived in Dutchess and the surrounding counties of the Mid-Hudson region. The authors have found over 900 individual freedom seekers who escaped from enslavement in the period 1735 to 1831. And the book identifies Dutchess County as having the highest percentage of freedom seekers in this area. So the table here shows some numbers. Whoops, that doesn't show that, does it? That's the book cover. Okay. So some of the numbers related to what was taken is that 81% of the freedom seekers were men. More than 60% were young, between the ages of 10 and 30. The earliest ads, as I mentioned, appear in 1735. They were not waiting for messages of assurance or go to this safe house. They were looking for help along the way, basically with others of their kind. We also see these ads with warnings from the owners of the danger that they faced. They help us understand why these early freedom seekers were starting a movement of Americans, both white and black, who would eventually assist them in their escape. I call this movement the Underground before the railroad. The Underground before the railroad. Here are a few examples. One advertisement is asking for the return of Jack, who ran away from his owners in Rhinebeck in 1738. Jack is described as a blacksmith and is much used to the sea. The ad offers a reward of 40 shillings for his return. It shows us that Jack was a valued and skilled craftsman and what his likely route of escape might be, in other words, water. Another ad for the return of Phyllis from Orange County, a Negro wench named Phyllis, who's about 19 years old, in a mulatto color, well set, and is well known in this city, has several changes of clothes and a false pass. Sometimes says she is free and may possibly endeavor to get on board some vessel, the better to facilitate her escape. Therefore, all captains, boatmen, and others are forewarned from carrying her off at their peril. And the third one is for a boy of only 14, Gilbert, who sought his freedom in 1815, again, before the beginning of the Underground Railroad. Gilbert was formerly from Dutchess County and is being sought now for only a $1 reward. Quote, said boy was formerly owned by Mrs. Elizabeth Rogers in Poughkeepsie. He is now working about the neighborhood in which she lives. This ad is probably referring to the legislature. So this ad is probably referring to Gilbert's returning to the place where he had been raised, where he might have had a family and from which he had been sold. Now you may have noted that two of the ads referred to the Hudson River. And there are dozens more like this. Those both reflect the attraction of the river for freedom seekers and serve as evidence of the importance of the river to the Underground Railroad. Along the banks of the Hudson, several free black communities developed in the late 1700s and early 1800s. These communities, sometimes including remnants of local Native American tribes, often became safe spaces for freedom seekers in our area. At one time during the late 1700s, early 1800s, there were about a half dozen of these free black communities dotted throughout Dutchess County. Now, one of the best known is the New Guinea community, not far from here in Hyde Park. You may have heard about it. It's sandwiched in between St. James Chapel and then hard on to the Crum Elbow Cemetery on the other side. There is evidence there. It has been excavated many years ago. It's now been covered over to protect it. Several freedom seekers found shelter there, and we have the records for this thanks to Bill Jethway's work, including one who escaped enslavement in Brazil and found his way up to Hyde Park. The Underground Railroad has for 2 centuries been debated, researched, and mythologized. It is both an exciting story of enslavement and freedom and a romance. It was often a secretive operation. People helping freedom seekers were breaking the law. But it was written about in newspapers and advocated openly at meetings, churches, and conventions. Now we know more about some of the individual people who worked as, quote, agents, and about anti-slavery and Underground Railroad conventions, churches, etc., that were in open support. More about all of that than we know about these specific buildings that shelter freedom seekers. So while this half knowledge can be frustrating, and believe me, as an historian, it's very frustrating, we should think of the Underground Railroad not as sites or individual people. Rather, the Underground Railroad was a movement of people across time and geography, all dangerous spaces, those geographies. The movement was committed to the idea that enslavement was wrong, it was evil, and that it would take a sustained, massive working together of disparate groups to bring it to an end. In Dutchess County, we've identified 2 major Underground Railroad paths. One was the River Trail, and the other along the eastern side of the county was known as the Quaker Trail. Whoops, did I skip over?
Yeah, you did.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Evidence for the Hudson River and its environs as a route for freedom seekers is extensive and speaks to a broad engagement with and support for freedom seekers. Those enslaved men and women came up through the Hudson Valley on both the east and west sides, by wagon and by walking, by boat, and later by train. On the west side, there is good evidence that the town of Port Jervis was a jumping off point for those from the south crossing through Pennsylvania. From there, they might cross the river over to Westchester County and find help with one of the Quaker communities or with the Foster AME Zion Church in Poughkeepsie. Others could go from Port Jervis directly north into Newburgh and then up to the Marlboro-Milton Quaker meeting and perhaps take the horse ferry across to Poughkeepsie. And then once in Poughkeepsie, they had options for the next steps on their journey. They might board a boat and travel up the river to Albany, or perhaps go east to the Quaker meetings Oswego or 9 Partners or the Ottawa. Freedom seekers who took the river route had an advantage over those traveling by land. Going from New York to Albany by land might take anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks. It would require a large commitment of escorts, wagons, shelter. There was a greater risk of being seen. The steamboat, starting in 1807, cut down travel time between New York City and Albany by more than half. Travel by schooner, barge, or other sailing vessel before the steamboat could take 15 hours or more. So a day and a half to 2 days. Steamboats could travel from New York to Albany in as little as 7 hours. It presented a great new opportunity for escape. In fact, one of the great historians of the Underground Railroad in this area, Fergus Bordewich, cites the falling off a cliff of notices and newspaper articles and scuttlebutt about runaway slave here, slave there, and slave there. All of this occurring after 1807. He attributes that to the fact that freedom seekers could now hide on schooners and boats, steamships, etc., so there would not be any sightings. Now, black sailors and boat captains, both enslaved and free, were working up and down the Hudson River. You'll recall that river piloting, water piloting was one of the skilled trades, and that many enslaved men or free blacks learned. And it was one of the few really, really important trades that black people were allowed to work in. Now, hotel service, other things like that, and boat piloting, working on boats, barges, etc. Those were occupations that took in a lot of free black people. So these boats would shelter many who were fleeing north, both from the Hudson Valley and from points south. Runaway slave ads, some of which we've already heard, warned sailors to stay away from these runaways. There's ample evidence that freedom seekers could board cargo boats and passenger steamships up to Albany. As I said, once there, they could go north into the Adirondacks and then a little bit further north and cross into Canada. Others, leaving Albany or Rensselaer, would actually go west. And then after 1825, they would be aided in their travel west by barges and packet boats traveling what? The Erie Canal. Anniversary coming up next year, probably. So they would get all the way over to Niagara, and then they would cross into St. Catharines, which was a sanctuary for freedom seekers. Stephen Myers was a formerly enslaved black boat captain and a leader in both the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. He was born a slave in Hoosick, New York, just up a ways. At age 18, he was emancipated and started work on a commercial steam vessel that sailed back and forth between Albany and New York City. He was a member of the New York Vigilance Committee, which was an organization founded in New York City by a gentleman named David Ruggles, also a black abolitionist. Its mission was twofold: to help move freedom seekers from New York City up through the Hudson Valley, and to prevent black people from being kidnapped and taken south into enslavement. This happened to both free and still unfree New Yorkers. Myers' residence served as a headquarters for Underground Railroad activity in the capital region and down here. He made perhaps, or he was able to bring to freedom as many as 1,000 freedom seekers. Now, the Quaker Trail to Freedom. This is the other route, main route through Dutchess County. So it may have been more limited, and it probably most certainly was more limited in terms of the number of people moving through it. This was nonetheless an extremely important trail. The reason for this is that the Quakers, as a religion, they played a leading role in the American colonies and states in the movement to end enslavement. Now, there developed in the mid-1700s a string of Quaker meeting houses stretching from Long Island north through Westchester, Dutchess, Columbia, all the way up to Vermont. It was said that a Quaker could travel along that path without ever having to sleep in a non-Quaker lodging. Idea. That would also be true for freedom seekers. In Dutchess, the leaders in that string included the Oblong meeting in Paulding, which if you haven't been there, you should definitely go visit, and the 9 Partners in Millbrook. There were others, many of them, Moore's Mills, Creek, Crum Elbow. These meetings provided a safe pathway for freedom seekers. And in the cases of the Oblong and 9 Partners, they did much, much more. Outside of Philadelphia, which was the center of Quaker sentiment prior to the American Revolution, it was Dutchess County that led the fight. It was a tough fight, since the owning of enslaved people was part of Quaker settlements in America since their first arrival in the 1600s. And some Quakers were very successful as slave traders. So these two facts complicate somewhat our ability to say that Quakers were against slavery, though certainly many were. Nonetheless, the Oblong took a big step when in 1767 it sent a letter down to the Purchase Quarterly Meeting. The Quarterly Meeting was where the local meetings here in New York were reported to, asking how could the owning of slaves not be contrary to Quaker principles. Neither Purchase nor the New York Annual Meeting was ready to give an answer in 1767. But at the same time, the 9 Partners Meeting was rooting out slavery among its members, even disowning some Quakers who refused to give the practice up. Both meetings not only assisted runaways in their journey, but they played leadership roles in the fight against enslavement. As another example, 9 Partners established a boarding school with a curriculum that was openly anti-slavery. Many, many well-known people studied there, including, for example, Lucretia Mott, David Anthony, who was the father of Susan B. Anthony, and others. The direct descendant of the 9 Partners is the Oakwood Friends School here in Poughkeepsie, where anti-slavery history and freedom principles remain embedded in the curriculum. Leaders within the broader Underground Railroad movement were made up of both free blacks and freedom seekers. One of the best known, of course, is Harriet Tubman, who, after escaping herself, made many return trips to Maryland to help others escape. She would pass by here on the Hudson on her way up to Albany and ultimately across the canal area and then up into St. Catharines. For at least one trip, she used the actual railroad going up along through Poughkeepsie to bring people to safety. But there were many, many others who played leading roles in the Underground Railroad and abolition movement, including William Still, who was from Philadelphia. He ran away from slavery in New Jersey. He started the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, and he was a center for runaway slaves from the South, and he recorded their stories. Over 600 100 stories of runaway slaves / freedom seekers, and you can get William Still's account in the local library or purchase it online. David Ruggles, very interesting little good-looking guy there. He was a writer, an activist. He hailed from Massachusetts, and he helped 600 freedom seekers through New York. He was a co-founder of the New York Committee of Vigilance. Now, the New York Committee of Vigilance was similar to what we saw along the river with Stephen Myers. One of the great dangers, as I hinted at earlier, is that even though enslavement was dying here in New York, during this period of the late 1700s and early 1800s, there was an incredible demand for enslaved people because Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas were all opening up new lands for cotton, for sugar, for rice, and other products. In fact, one of the interesting things is a lot of the enslaved people in North Carolina and especially Virginia, where their tobacco land was now, couldn't grow anything, not even grass. Owners of enslaved people in Virginia were selling their enslaved people down south. There was a long march of enslaved people who are now being sold and taken further south. This is a little complicated, but in terms of the end of slavery in New York, it was a real mess. A real mess. New York finally passed an abolition law that took effect on July 4th, 1789. It declared that any child born to an enslaved woman after that date was, quote, free. But that child would have to serve his or her mother's owner until the age of 28, if a male, and 25, if a female. So with this legislation, permanent hereditary slavery did have an end date, but forced servitude, you might think there's another word for forced servitude, would continue. And in addition, the owner of such a child could abandon that child. The child then was taken over by the overseers of the poor, and then the owner could take back that child or another one, and they would get a stipend from New York State to care for that child. Okay, that's only the first part. We got 2 more to go. This was essentially a scheme that allowed slaveholders to abandon their children, but also get something back in return. And also, this law in 1790 only spoke about the children. It said nothing about freeing all of the people who were still enslaved in 1799. They were not going to be free. So now a new statute comes out in 1817, and it gets more fun. So, formerly enslaved owners who had abandoned the children and taken them back, they were still going to be compensated, but now they were required to provide those children the ability to read by age 18 or give them some other type of schooling. Also, the terms of the length of the indenture changed, and we had the 28 and 25. Now, any child who was taken back by an owner and had to provide service, all of that would end at age 21. And then it also said, and this came into effect in July 4th, 1827, is that all of the men and women who had been enslaved prior to July 4th, 1799. They would all be free on July 4th, 1827. It's a landmark. It's a very, very important date. Chattel slavery, hereditary slavery, was now ended. And that's a damn good thing. New York was next to last in ending slavery in the North. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 enslaved people were still in New York at the time of 1827. So 200 years of hereditary enslavement is gone. But this milestone begs the question about all of those children. Remember, they owed service. So it said, if you gave birth to a child on July 3rd, 1827, that child would owe 21 years of service, which means theoretically you could be in mandatory service to your former parent's owner until 1848. You can't make this stuff up. Only our great state of New York would do this kind of stuff. There were still, a lot of people probably didn't even realize, because if you look at census data for 1850, or the New York census data for 55, and the federal for 1860, there are still a number of entries: slave, 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 slave. So. During 1849 to 1850, Congress was enmeshed in a series of debates involving competing interests of free and slave states. I'm not going to go back in the history of this, but a lot of this began after the purchase of the Mexican territory, and then developing territories from Kansas and Nebraska, and the northern states refusing to let slavery spread, the southern states threatening to secede if they didn't get their way. It was a mess. One of the complaints of the southern states was that northern anti-slavery organizations and sympathizers were aiding and abetting the freedom seekers who were continuing to leave the South and head toward freedom. So to address their complaints, in yet another blow to freedom, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. You may remember that from school, which was part of this grander compromise of 1850. So that act required that enslaved people be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. So this was meant to assuage southern slave owners. But the act had just the opposite effect in the North, where anti-slavery advocates formed vigilante committees and worked both clandestinely and in the open to thwart the intent of the act. Fugitive slave laws made the Underground Railroad even more important, but even more dangerous. The southern production of cotton and sugar, as I mentioned, was booming. Enslaved people were in great demand, and legal means to get additional workers were limited, making the kidnapping of free blacks almost a necessity. The slave hunter is among us. Be on your guard. Be ready to receive them whenever they come. And many other similar ads fill newspapers and town halls and churches across the North, leading to the growth and the start of even more anti-slavery societies, including right here in Dutchess County, where in the 1830s, first the Poughkeepsie Anti-Slavery Society, and then in 1839, the beginning of the Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society. Both of those organizations were put together and led by a coalition of free blacks and white anti-slavery advocates. One of our own Poughkeepsie residents fell victim to this law. John Bolden was born into slavery on a plantation near Columbia, South Carolina. After he was sold to two other men, he escaped. Around 1840, we think, fleeing north, accompanied by his younger brother and another enslaved woman named Susan. They came to Poughkeepsie, where Susan married a gentleman by the name of Francis Moore. So the Moores, John Bolden and his brother David Bolden, were listed in the 1850 census as living in the same address at 20 Academy Street. There was a Moore Bolden tailor shop located on Liberty Street. Now, sometime after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, there was a white woman living in Poughkeepsie, but who had been originally from South Carolina, recognized John Bolden and alerted his former owner. In August 1851, the owner called on the U.S. Marshal, because remember, the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act was the United States law, not a state law. The Marshal came up from New York City, waited, because he had already heard that there were crowds forming, and secreted John Bolden onto the train back to New York City. A very quick trial. There was no habeas corpus for John Bolden. The judge, of course, found for the plaintiff, and John Bolden was returned to South Carolina. This, thank goodness, caused an uproar in Poughkeepsie. And a large group of Poughkeepsie residents, as well as a few others from the area, raised about $2,000 to purchase his freedom and also cover his transportation back. So that was the happy ending for the John Bolden episode. And here again is another walk. If you're in the rural cemetery, you can see the gravestone here. And Dutchess County Historical Society, the Black History group from which sprang Celebrating the African Spirit, was responsible for getting a headstone placed on his site. So, in closing, let me just say that for both enslaved and free people in New York, the Hudson River marked a clear path toward freedom by the Underground Railroad and through people's own efforts. Enslavement, racial oppression encompassed all the space, rivers and lands. And despite a transformative experience of freedom, Black New Yorkers remained everywhere at risk. For both enslaved and free Black Americans, everywhere were spaces of danger, within which mishap and tragedy might strike at any time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Give Peter a big round of applause for that wonderful presentation. I think we've all learned an awful lot. Does anybody have any questions? We have a couple of minutes. I'm sure Peter could answer some questions. Just before you leave, I'd like to just say that our pavilion is still open. If anybody wants to buy anything or look at our, hats, shirts, whatever we have, feel free. The walkway talks are always free, but there is a donation box if you want to support the walkway. You can give a donation, become a member. We're always looking for support. Okay? So let's take some questions.
Go ahead. Go on. Nice and loud.
Are you familiar with the Snow House in Teekskill, which has been reputed to be a stop on the Underground Railway?
I've heard of it, yes.
Okay, it's located right across from the shopping center.
Yep.
It was owned by the Stowe family. It eventually became a part of the Mission Society, with a very exclusive private school that got 50 students. And then it was turned over to the state and became a residential treatment center for mostly their children, who are talking about years. And it's now condos. But the main building, I think it was the main house of the estate, is reputed to have been where the site was underneath. And I know my mother worked there also, and she had been in the basement. But it could be one of those kids too, so I don't know.
Yeah, probably a myth, but it would need more research. It would need. Just quickly on this issue of houses, the very first thing you have to do is, when was the house built? If it was built after 1860, yeah. Second most important thing, you must find out who owned the building for its entire life cycle. Third thing, you have to research those people who live there and find out what they did and if there might have been any possible connection to anti-slavery activities. If you get through all of those three hurdles, then we can keep going from there. Now, before you all run out of stuff, we'll take more questions. I do want to let you know that one of our newest projects for the MHHP is the creation of memory quilts around the issue of enslaved people and freedom seekers. One of the first ones that was done, we have up here, actually I think this came out of work at the First Congregational Church. No, tell me.
No, it's a first sample quilt that
First-
we did. We've done now with Cass has done one. Oakland
yes,
School has
Oakland
done one.
School.
This is the first one that we completed from people from around the region.
So Laura Chenman is here and Anita is back here if you have questions about the quilts. Okay. Who else?
Where's that store now right now?
It's in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery.
Okay.
Yep.
St. Peter's Cemetery.
No, it's in the Rural Cemetery.
Speaking about the quilts,
Yep.
I've heard stories, and it's been, some people believe it, some people don't, that there was a quilt code back in the day, where people would see quilts and
Right.
know where to go from them and that.
It's a myth.
Oh, is it?
There's absolutely zero evidence. This was a story that came out. It was a woman who created a story that came out of almost thin air. But there is absolutely no evidence of quilt codes.
There were two other questions. Did you have your hand up?
How successful was the bounty hunting for capturing the runaway?
Well, you know the story of Solomon Northrop, just up the road here in Columbia County. There were others. How successful? It's hard to quantify, but one example of how dangerous it could be is the growth of what these were called vigilance societies, not just in the big cities. There were notices here in Poughkeepsie that you had to be on the lookout for such and such a type of person. So the danger, and there's nothing good about enslavement, but a lot of free blacks were kidnapped and taken into slavery down south. So the risk, that's why this risk for free black people, it was constant. It was constant. In the early days, with the slave codes in effect, etc., you had to carry a pass. You had to prove that you could move from this space over to this space. If you were a white person, you could just move back and forth as you wanted to. So the risk of capture, jail time, kidnapping was very, very strong.
One question for the judge.
Yes.
Yes, sir, Professor. I see that Frederick Douglass, prior to the passage of the Fugitive here at the Congressional Church
Yes.
in Poughkeepsie.
He actually spoke here 3 times. He spoke before the first Congregational Church that we see now was built, which was in 1859. The church began in 1837, and it used a couple of other church buildings from that period up to. So he was invited here once, and then I think twice, I know at least once, and probably twice, by the AME Zion Church. They sponsored presentation. There was a walk and then a speech given to a huge crowd up on College Hill.
So my question is, after the runaway Free
Yep.
Act of 1850,
Yes.
when the Southern states used federal government
Yes.
for state rights, I believe the Appalachian Harriet Beecher Stowe published her famous Uncle Tom's Cabin. The abolitionist movement grew great in strength here in the States. My question is, why do you think it is that Lincoln lost Poughkeepsie in the election of 1860 and then 1864, yet he carried the count one time?
It's a great question. If we had enough time to go into statistics, but that is great. In the early years of the 19th century, Poughkeepsie and Dutchess County they had no use for abolitionists. None at all. In fact, there really weren't any abolitionists until about 1830. The first recruitment by the American Anti-Slavery Society that took place in the early 1830s, the speaker going around couldn't even find a place to speak on a lot of occasions. The Poughkeepsie Journal, earlier on in the 1800s, was strongly opposed to abolitionists and all of these other rabble-rousers. By the time of a few months before, actually a year before, there was a very interesting article in the Poughkeepsie Journal noting the hanging of John Brown. And they said, essentially, we don't agree with the tactics that he used, but we do support what he stands for. So that was a fairly big pendulum swing. But you're right. Now, another thing to add on to what you're saying, if you were to take a look at the record of 4 votes, 1821, 1848, 1860, and 1869. And the vote across New York State was, should we get rid of the mandatory $250 worth of property that was required for Black Americans to vote? All 4 times. We want that mandatory requirement. White men didn't have to pay $200. Black men did. It wasn't until New York got a chance to decide whether they would support the 15th Amendment, which then ended restrictions on voting based on color. New York also somewhat qualified. They did support that. So, yeah, a lot. Now, what that recognizes, and I didn't concentrate on it today, what that recognizes is not only opposition to anti-slavery and abolition, it recognizes the racialized nature of oppression under slavery and other ways.
Okay, I think we're going to end it there.
I'll be here.
Yes, Peter's here, and thank you all for coming. And there's some little half sheets over on the table if you want to know what the next what we talk is about. They're all listed for you. Okay, feel free to.